Hi, everybody. Um, I only got 25 of those self-evaluations for participation from Friday. So if you haven't evaluated your own participation from last week, go to that link that's in last Friday's folder on Brightspace and answer that little survey that asks you how you feel about your own participation last week, okay? So we are about, let's see, about here. I think this is where we ended. Does that look right to people? On Friday, we were talking about the Caspi, the famous Caspi experiment that showed that there's a combination of things um, that make people respond to life events in a more healthy or less healthy way. Um, so this is, I want to get this in read view. I think this is better. Oops. Okay. Oops. All right. So I also wanted to show you this is a poster that I worked on with my, oh, I can't move around reading view. Well, anyway, this is a poster that I worked on with my advisor from my postdoc. And what it looked at was people with two different versions of this gene, and it was a longitudinal study. So we had been watching these people. Well, I hadn't. I joined the study when the participants were about 18 years old, and now they're about 30, I think. And but my mentor had been studying them since their mothers were pregnant with them. Okay, so she studied their prenatal environments, and she did what's called the strange situation procedure with them and their moms when they were about 12 months old, 18 months old, 36 months old, a bunch of times. And in the strange situation procedure is a really interesting, a really, a really interesting lab procedure that you use with infants and toddlers that helps you get an idea how healthy the relationship is between a really young child and their parent. And most kids, whether they're healthy or not, um, will do some crying during this procedure because a part of it is being separated from their mom or dad or whoever's the primary caregiver, a grandmother. And in this study, it was all moms. Okay. So the healthiest form of relationship with parent is called a secure attachment relationship. And secure babies cry a lot when their moms leave the room. And that's a significant part of this kind of procedure in which you study kids. And so crying on its own is not unhealthy, right? Babies are kind of supposed to cry. But there are other babies who cry when their mothers leave and don't stop crying when the mom comes back. They're inconsolable. And then some babies don't cry when their mom leaves, they don't care. And when the mother comes back, they still don't care. So there are healthy and unhealthy ways to be attached to a parent. Okay. So by the time we did this study, the children had grown up to be about 28 years old, I think. And we did just swabs of the inside of people's cheeks, and we could get a DNA analysis of them based on those just swabs of the I think it's called buccal swabs. And they got put on dry ice and sent to like Denmark or somewhere where they assessed the participants' DNA for short and long versions of the 5-HTT gene. And do you guys remember which ones are associated with less healthy responses to stress?
Too short.
Yeah. So, two short versions of the gene are associated with a more extreme response to life stress. And then, even one short one can make people more responsive to stress in a negative way. And the people who tend to be most impervious to stress have two long versions of the gene. And so we found in this study that although the length of the genes that people had did not determine what kind of attachment relationship they had with their parents, which is kind of good because that's supposed to be nurture, right? It did determine, and this is, 27 years earlier, you could predict looking at their DNA that we collected when they were 28, you could predict which ones cried more in the strange situation procedure 27 years earlier. So if someone who had never met these kids looked at the data and saw which ones had, two short versions of the gene, it was about a quarter of the sample, right? And, saw which ones had long, long and which ones had a long, short, that would predict which ones cried the most. So if you looked at that data and then went back to the videotapes, because they were like these old, we got them transferred to DVD, but originally they were these really old VHS tapes, or they might have even been Betamax way back then. Then you could predict from their DNA which ones cried more in infancy. It was kind of a retrospective longitudinal study. And that's pretty huge, right? That's a huge distance in time. And it shows that kids who cry more, it probably has more to do with their genes, right? Than how they're parented. So a baby that cries a lot in general is not a sign of poor health, right? Because plenty of those babies who cried a ton were securely attached. And they probably just had two short versions of the gene. Does that make sense to you guys? So people who cry a lot or who stress out a lot in response to the environment, there might be a genetic component to that. Well, there definitely is.
Yeah. I have a question. So, with this like DNA test, could you possibly like tell if these genes will get passed on to their children and kind of give that genetic short, long to see with like nurture and nature for their children?
Well, I don't know if somebody with two long versions of the gene could pass on a short version. They used to consider it a mutation, but they don't now. So, I mean, I don't know a ton about genetics, but if it were a mutation, it sounds like it could happen anytime, right? But I think if you have two long versions, I don't know how you could pass on a short version. Does anybody know that here? Any budding geneticists here?
I think I was just thinking about like if like the parent has like long genes and their children will kind of have the same experience that they had, rather if someone who had a short gene passed that short gene on to their children, they'd probably cry more when they're
Right.
separated from their parents.
Right. And it's hard to tease that out unless they're, raised separately from their parents. But I'm sure there'll be plenty of studies on that. So, whatever genes my kids have, they both do because they're identical. right? And if they had been raised separately, you know, it would be even more evidence that it was their genes and not their environments that caused them to cry more or less than other kids. Um, but the thing to remember is that one is contributed from each parent. So, each parent would have to have, if that's the case, then each parent would have to have two short versions for the child to definitively be getting two shorts. But I should look into that, but I'm just not a genetics expert. Um, yeah. But yeah, it's definitely the intergenerational transmission of a tendency to be reactive to stress, right? And they've even seen that in rats and mice. Like, there's a gene that um, helps rats kind of calm down um, in the face of stress. And if those rats aren't licked enough by their rat moms, those genes turn off because of epigenetics. Genes can turn on and off. And so, even if a rat's born with good genes, if they're raised by a kind of paws off rat mom, that gene can get turned off and they can turn into anxious rats. And then the rats that, then if you put a rat who's biologically born to a paws off rat, but has the gene for calming down. And then you take that rat and put him with a caring, nurturing rat mom, it turns on and they're not anxious. You can also make it turn on just by brushing them with like a makeup brush. So it doesn't require, it's clearly the tactile stimulation. And there's a lot of evidence that humans need tactile stimulation too. And we'll talk about that probably next time. But clearly humans need tactile stimulation, and primates do too, and monkeys do. If you have any of you seen Harlow's studies of monkeys, where he showed that monkeys preferred, what did baby monkeys prefer? They were given a choice between a terry cloth mother, fake mother, and a mother that provided food. And which did they hang out with more? Emily?
The cloth mother.
Yeah, they stayed with the cloth mother. And why? Anyone? Uh-huh. Emily?
Because it kind of provided like comfort. She would go to like the mother with food, like just to eat, and then like automatically go back to the one who provided the comfort.
Right. So tactile comfort is an important part of being a healthy monkey infant, right? Um, and studies have shown of animals and humans that that's the case, right? So if you look at studies of orphanages, which we will next time, I think, you'll see that there are pretty negative outcomes to kids who are neglected and don't get tactile stimulation. And interestingly, when Harlow put baby monkeys in cages and didn't have any other monkeys interact with them, when they became adults, if he let an adult monkey enter the cage, those babies that had been isolated would attack the other adult monkey because they did not know how to interact. And so they would be aggressive. So there's like a key, definitive period of development where interaction and tactile stimulation just have to occur. Okay. So some of it can be mediated by nurturance, but we don't have any evidence that the short and long versions of the 5-HTT gene can be changed. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to show you this clip. This is from Scientific American Frontiers, and it shows a couple different things. there's some information about epigenetics and genes turning on and off there. And I think there's a little bit about those rat moms that I told you about. And do you guys know who this person is on the screen? He's so famous. It's so funny. Have you heard of the TV show MASH? Okay, he's the main character in that. And that was like the most popular TV show for decades. And he was the man when I was in like grade school. And it was so funny because the student was like, "Is that Alan Alda?" She came up after class. I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "Oh, I date his grandson." And I was like, wow, and like nobody thinks anything of it because you guys don't know who he is. And I was duly impressed. But anyway, this will be interesting. So I'll just show you the clip. Please keep your cameras on because I like to see if people are interested while we're watching this.
For our final story, I'm once again having my head examined, this time in the lab of Helen Neville at the University of Oregon, Eugene. You know, I think after the show, a lot of people will be wearing these.
We've had many requests for extra hats after our subjects see how fetching they are.
Yes, a lot of people want to wear them out in the street.
Oh, absolutely.
Cute little suspenders.
You don't want it to slip now.
Are we afraid my helmet will like whip off if I turn my head too
When
fast?
we turn the propeller on,
Yeah.
we want to make sure you don't go anywhere.
I'm going to ask you some dignified questions while I'm wearing it.
That button.
Now a special gel is added to each of the 32 electrodes in the hat. Okay.
Yep.
The gel helps make electrical contact between the electrodes in my head.
Too high.
That's great. It has to be firmly worked into place to be effective. Yes, well, I think you drove the gel right into my scalp.
But
So
we
you're
certainly
making
got a
direct
good
contact
reading
with the
there.
neurons there. I think you'll get a very good reading.
Now let's go to the right hemisphere. T6.
62.9. Guess it's time to jam another Q-tip in my brain. That was the warm-up.
Go in. Slowly.
But for the actual experiment, I'm going to have to plug in, get comfortable, and relax. You going to hold this?
No, it's not. We're going to check first that we have good contact from all the electrodes and that we can see good, clean signal out of your head. And then we'll begin with the experiment.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll just relax. When they're listening in on brain waves, neuroscientists like Helen have to get their subjects to reduce their muscle activity to a minimum so the faint signals from the brain can come through.
Okay, Alan, this looks really good. Keeping your eyes nice and still, your muscles are really relaxed. Keep that up.
Helen studies where in the brain we process language. My task is simply to follow each sentence and register whether or not it makes sense. That one seems okay. Here's the next. Sue shared her candy with her best boat. Well, that's nonsense. But actually, the task itself isn't important. That's just to hold my attention. In fact, the system is continuously checking every electrode to look for tiny changes that might coincide with each new word flashing up. Averaged over hundreds of subjects, these signals show where in the brain different words are processed. The result is fascinating. Vocabulary words like light, daytime, candy, boat are processed in different places in both left and right hemispheres. But grammar words, her, with, the, in, are concentrated in parts of the left hemisphere. So for language, different parts of the brain have different jobs. That's true, at least, for adults. The question Helen Neville asked was, is the same true for children?
Hi, Daddy.
14-month-old Dossie is at the stage of life when we rapidly acquire language.
That's so pretty.
To find out what's going on in her brain, she needs to put on that charming hat with the electrodes, this time in a fetching shade of green.
Oh, big bird.
Dossie, however, has other ideas. I can't say I blame her.
Oh,
Well, how about the blue one?
oh. See? It's pretty.
Or maybe the yellow will do the trick.
Okay. Oh, she's taking it off Ernie. She's liberate Ernie from
Fortunately, Davy, her brother, couldn't see what all the fuss was about. With stuffed animals to hold his attention, he settled down to listen to a series of words while the system measured his brain's response.
bottle, carbon, cat, diaper.
The result, once again averaged over many subjects, looks completely different from the adult pattern. Very young children process language all over the brain. But then pretty soon, by about age 4 or 5, the typical adult specialized areas are emerging. This kind of result has important implications for education in general. Are there things we should be doing sooner when we educate children?
We don't know when the critical time windows are, when learning math, learning music, learning science, different kinds of learning would be optimized. But I don't have any doubt that there are such critical windows of opportunity. We just need to do the research to determine when they are. What we do know is that from the point of view of language learning, early is better.
For people who learn more than one language, the early locking in of the brain's language areas makes a big difference. Arthur Go, for example, speaks fluent Chinese and English.
Where were you born?
Singapore,
How old were you when you started learning English?
about 3 or 4
So in school.
in school.
So while English is Arthur's second language, he learned it when he was still young. When he's tested, his brain's response to English is indistinguishable from that of a native English speaker, with the same specialized areas for grammar and vocabulary.
Where were you born?
I was born in Yat Yat, Vietnam.
Yeah.
English is also Nick Hong's second language, but he didn't start learning it until age 10. And when responding to English, his brain looks different. There's no single grammar area. Nick ran up against a limit that confronts all late learners of languages. In my case, I started studying French in my teens. I got really serious about it in my late teens, and I thought I could speak pretty well. What were the things limiting me?
The sound of the language and the grammar of the language are the parts of the language that suffer most from delayed learning of a language. So you probably speak with an accent in French. People will probably tell you that. And your grammar probably isn't perfect. On the other hand, you probably have a huge vocabulary.
Nobody who learns a language after childhood can expect to speak it perfectly.
Old King Cole was a merry old soul.
And a mere old soul was he.
So don't blame the speakers. For grammar and pronunciation, at least, you can't teach an old brain new tricks.
He called for his pipe and he called for his pole.
And he called for his fiddlers 3.
Every fiddler, he had a fine fiddle.
And a very fine fiddle had he. Tweedledee, went the fiddlers.
But there's none so rare as can compare.
The King Cole and his fiddlers 3.
If I didn't have words, I'd probably... Back in the lab, I met another of Helen Neville's test subjects, Dean Gate.
Okay, so I'm going to pause share. Okay, so can somebody tell me a little bit about that EEG? Like, what's that measuring? The cap on the head. What's the deal with that? Emily?
So basically, it's interpreting brain waves and how the brain responds to language in this case.
Uh-huh. And what are the little wires going into the scalp, and why is that being used? Someone else? Like, how is that working? I mean, just in a very vague way.
Someone said in the chat they measure the electrical activity in the brain.
Okay, I got the chat back up. Yes, they do. Thanks. Yeah, and so what's the gel about? Do you guys know why they use the gel on the scalp? Anybody? Or a guess? More conductivity. Yeah, somebody's an electricity person now. Yeah, so they stick gel there in your scalp, and they attach an electrode to it, which has a metal, I guess. And so, brain activity is electrical. So when there's brain activity right under the skull, and there's a metal wire there, and there's gel, like helping the electricity conduct, wherever the electrode is closest to electrical activity in the brain, it can pick that up and relay that information to a connected computer, right? So that's how we figure out things like what part of the brain is active while they're looking at certain words, right? And so who can tell me, how that differs, how those EEGs differ in people who are very young versus older?
It's harder to distinguish certain areas of the brain in young children because they're still learning the language, so they're kind of not able to process it as much as adults do.
Right. Right. So, when you're first born, your whole brain lights up no matter what you're doing. There aren't, it's kind of sad, but something called pruning happens in the first years of your life, where these neural connections between brain cells in your brain kind of shut down, because it's kind of like trying to get like a super highway instead of a million little cow paths in your brain, so that messages can be sent more quickly, right? And naturally, we have specific parts of our brain that tend to get reserved for very specific functions. So for hearing language, there's usually areas near the auditory cortex where we process language, right where your ears are. So that's easy to remember. And then there are different parts of your brain that visually perceive different nouns, different words like house and face and things like that. Okay, so that's kind of why it's easier to learn a language when you're younger, right? Because all that specialization isn't set in stone, right? Your brain is more plastic, meaning more malleable. So you can have, even with more than one language, it's not as hard for people to incorporate new languages, right? So when people learn later, what parts of language suffer the most?
Didn't they say like the grammar?
Yes.
Like,
Yep, grammar. And what did you say after that?
like the accent, because your brain isn't as like neuroplastic, I think is the word, as it is like when you're young.
Exactly, neuroplastic. Yeah. Grammar and pronunciation suffer the most. So how many of you have taken a second language? Do you have to in high school still? Yeah. How many years do you have to take in high school? 3? Yeah, that's pretty much what it was in my high school. Okay, so what was the hardest part for you? Was it learning vocabulary? Or was it conjugating verbs? Or was it the accent? I should have done a little poll. Okay, so the 3 choices are pronunciation, conjugation, like, future tense, past tense, present tense of verbs. Okay, and what was the other one? So pronunciation, conjugate, and just vocabulary. Okay, so raise your hand if the hardest thing for you was pronouncing things.
There's a lot of people that are saying it all in the chat.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, where is it? Oh, okay. Conjugation. The accent. Okay. All right, and nobody's saying vocabulary, right? Vocab was, if you hate language, it's not easy either, but it's the more basic part, right? You can just like kind of code it, pair it up, memorize it, rote memorization, right? Has anybody taken more than one language besides English? Madison, Rosie, kind of Lily, kind of Amanda, Brevin. Right. Wow, a lot of people. Okay, did that make it harder? Did it make it harder to learn the third language when you had already learned the second language? That's like interference. But did some, huh?
For me, only like I was learning like I started off learning Spanish first, then I learned sign language, but like it's still a working process with the sign language.
Oh, okay. And they might be different enough, right? Anyone else?
So my experience, I learned, well, my uncle, him and my cousin and my aunt speak fluent German, and they also speak English. So like I've also learned Spanish and some of German, which I'm still trying to learn more so that I can speak with them. But definitely like I went to Germany and no one knows English over there, so I kind of had to learn like the normal sayings that everyone does just so that people understood sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, like conversational instead of like literary academic. Yeah. All right.
From my experience, like I learned a language like when I was young. So like I learned Creole when I was younger, and like I had like a problem with interference because Creole is basically like French. So like it has like French has like a distinct accent. So like there'll be times where like I couldn't turn off my French accent when I was speaking English. So like I'll speak really, really fast in English.
Did you live in Louisiana or where did you speak Creole?
Oh, my family's from Haiti, and we came here.
Okay. And what'd you learn after that?
Oh, Spanish like in high school, but I didn't
Okay.
really pick much of it up.
Uh-huh. Okay. So which one was easier to learn?
I can't tell you because I think I learned it simultaneously, so I can't really tell you.
Oh, you mean English and Creole you learned?
Yeah.
But in terms of like Spanish versus Creole.
Oh, Spanish is way harder.
Yeah. Yeah, the earlier you learn it, the easier, right? Has anybody studied abroad or just gone abroad?
So I'm from Haiti. So in my experience, it was the reverse. So I speak French and Creole, but like learning English was a struggle because there's so many like vocabs and like like little like rules with the English.
Oh
So
yeah.
like, that was the worst learning English. It's still a struggle to be quite honest.
So many irregular verbs and
Right.
weird not phonetic spellings, like spellings that make no sense, right? Yeah, like I tried to learn Ukrainian for a while because my ex-husband is Ukrainian. And so what's cool is once you learn this, it's a different alphabet. Okay. But once you learn the alphabet, you can read anything correctly, right? Like it's phonetic. You just can't mispronounce it. I mean, there's some R sounds I didn't do right. But you can read anything once you get the alphabet. But then they have, what do you call it? Cases, like when you conjugate a verb, it changes based on who the verb is respective to.
The person.
Yeah. So
Like
it's
first person, second person, third person.
yeah. So if you know how like in Spanish, certain nouns have different, you have an A or an O on the end or an E, right? In Ukrainian, you conjugate the verb, but then it changes also based on who you're throwing the ball to. So throwing would be a different word if you're throwing the ball to a dog, throwing the ball to your friend who's a girl, throwing the ball to your father. And I was like, yeah, never mind, I'm not learning this. I was like, I'm good. I learned a bunch of vocab, a lot of conversational phrases, stuff like that. All right, let's go back to the clip.
When did you learn to sign?
I learned when I was 4 years old.
What brought that about? How did you learn to sign?
When my parents found out that I was deaf, they found out that when I was 2, and they decided to send me to the deaf school when I was 4 years old. And there is where I learned to sign.
When Dean's response is tested in the same way as for a spoken language, the result looks like that of any other first language, with typical grammar and vocabulary areas. It makes sense because he learned sign language while still young. But take a look at this. It's a peripheral vision test in which Dean has to detect the flashing squares on the edges of the screen while concentrating on the one in the center. When his brain response is mapped, it shows he's using both the normal vision processing area and large sections usually devoted to sound. Of course, vision takes on critical importance when you're deaf. When I took the same test, my peripheral vision wasn't as good as Dean's, and I didn't use that extra processing area in the brain. This is the flip side of development in the young brain. Not only is it locking in particular parts for specific functions, but it can also invent new uses for sections if necessary. That's just amazing that you've got this the brain is kind of malleable like a piece of clay in a way. It's not so hard and fast as at least I thought it was.
That's right. There's no doubt about the fact that there are very strong biases or likelihoods according to which the brain will develop. That's why in 99.9% of all the people, this is visual brain, this is auditory brain, this is the part that's important for touch, this is the part that's important for language. But these strong genetic biases can be changed, they can be modified within limits, within time limits. This is a sheep's brain.
Our knowledge of what's going on inside all brains,
Of a cat.
cats, sheep's, or people's, is still limited.
It's a human brain. We've cut it so you can see what
It's easier to explain the processes taking place in the distant stars than in our own heads.
Right above the ears is important for hearing. These lobes right here are important for making memories. Very top part is important, controlling movement.
That's one reason Helen likes to talk to school kids about what we do know.
Oh.
Great challenges exist in neuroscience. We don't yet understand how 3 pounds of tissue produce consciousness, how our brains turn into our minds and into ourselves.
Okay, you can eat that part.
The brain may be the final frontier of science, waiting to be crossed by tomorrow's scientists.
Like making decisions. The left side is for controlling your right side.
There's a lot more of the brain that we didn't talk about. That's because scientists certainly don't by any means know what all the different parts of the brain do. That's why maybe some of you guys will grow up to be brain scientists. Because there's the most complicated structure in the universe. It's going to take a lot of people to figure out how it works.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. Oops, what did I do? Okay, so how old was the I forgot his name. Was his name Dean? The man who was hard of hearing? I can't remember, but do you guys remember how old he was when he started learning sign language?
He was 4. His parents sent him to the deaf school.
Yep. Yeah, so they discovered he was deaf when he was 2, and then they decided to send him to the school for the deaf, and that started when he was 4. So how do you think he signs? What do you think his signing is like? Would you say it's plastic or highly specialized in his brain? If he learned it at that young age.
Would it be highly specialized?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably just like somebody who learned English as their first language, it's just as kind of solidified as his brain as English would be in, say, Alan Alda's brain, right? So what were the results? Tell me a little bit about the study they did on him and Alan Alda and how they compared in their scores on that test. Someone else, somebody new. Come on, you can do it, peoples. It doesn't have to be a perfect answer, by the way.
Some of the visual processing was spread into like the auditory area of the brain.
Right, because the test was on peripheral vision, right? So that was looking at vision, right? And what part of the brain did the deaf man get to use that Alan Alda wasn't using to process that? The, parts of the brain specialized for hearing, including the auditory cortex. And why did they think that might be? Why would it go to vision as opposed to some other sense? Like, why wasn't he like a super smeller or a super taster? Emily?
I think because like vision is like the next like kind of most important thing, like for him to like figure everything out, because like he can't hear anything but he can see, and it said that his like peripheral vision was way better than a person who could actually like hear.
Right. And why would peripheral vision in particular, right, like this vision over here, why would that be particularly important for someone who can't hear? Brian?
Because like if something's going on to the right of me, I could hear it and like turn my head. But like for him, he has to be able to see it just because he won't be alerted by noise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like if something's coming at you from behind and you can't hear it, it's good if you have great peripheral vision, right? Have you seen those explanations of why animals have different pupils? And predators have those slit pupils so they can focus on their prey, and then the hunted have those weird wider pupils so they can have better peripheral vision, because they got to see what's behind them, so if you are more susceptible to something to the side or behind you, it would make sense that you'd use all your resources for that, right? It kind of reminds me, there's always like a superhero show or a hero show where somebody develops a particularly, savant-esque or superhero-esque skill, based on some kind of injury or accident that they had. All right, so what if somebody had an accident when they were, 17 or like around your age that resulted in them losing their hearing? Would that have the same effect? Would you develop, would your auditory brain get used for vision?
Wouldn't it just make new connections? I don't know if that makes sense. Let's
It would attempt to, right?
Mm.
But after around your age, but really around 30, the number of neurons in your brain just starts to decline. There's new research, actually somebody I did my postdoc with, which is kind of cool, and she was a single mother. She does research on mindfulness meditation, and she found that kind of master meditators it actually increases neuron connections in your brain to if you meditate a lot. And whenever I share this with the class, I'm like, why don't I meditate? But I just can't make myself do it. I do it, a little but I'm like, I need neurons. But anyway, yeah, so injuries, because the brain is so plastic when people are young, people can recover and adapt so much better when they're young because their brain hasn't become so specialized that they can't use other, they can't use it for other things. So that's why if a child has a stroke, it has far fewer, long-term impacts than if somebody who's over 60 has a stroke, right? When a child has a brain injury, it can be, horrible, but the same injury in a child versus in an older person has totally different effects, right? Sometimes I show a clip, I think I might show it in here, and it's of a girl who had such horrible seizures that she had to have half of her brain removed. And she functions almost completely normally because each side of the brain controls the motor movements of the other brain, each side of the brain controls the motor movements of the other side of the body. She has a little bit of a change in usage of her arm on the other side of the body, and even less impairment in her leg on the other side of her body. So it's kind of amazing how high functioning she is because she had half of her brain removed when she was so young. Now, if you guys had half of your brain removed now, the outcome wouldn't be okay, right? And if I did, forget about it, right? So that's how important plasticity and specificity are, right? So if you're going to have a brain injury, get it in soon. So you can, right, like you get to plan them. But yeah. All right, so why don't we stop there? And I'll see you guys on Wednesday. If you haven't done your little survey about how you participated last week, please do it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.